My name is Kristen Crowley, and I'm a longtime supporter of Samaritan House's mission to combat domestic violence and human trafficking right here in Hampton Roads. This evening, we will learn about how human trafficking impacts all of us in Hampton Roads and the way that Samaritan House and others are addressing the issues. You can join me in supporting local survivors of human trafficking by texting SAM, S-A-M, to 50155 or scan the QR code on your screen to make that vital donation.
It's one of the most pressing human rights issues of our time.
And all of us were trapped.
Human trafficking, it's a global issue, and Hampton Roads is not immune.
We have active cases here in Hampton Roads.
The Polaris Project says 25 million people are being trafficked worldwide. A fraction of those victims are either trafficked through our area or groomed for sex and labor work in the 757.
News 3 Investigates is dedicated to shedding light on the problem that's plaguing the place we call home.
And sharing the stories of the people who have survived the unthinkable. I'm Jessica Larche.
And I'm Zach Dahlheimer. It's a troubling thought, but we just can't ignore it.
And the only way to eliminate human trafficking is to know what we're up against. Human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, traffickers use fraud or coercion to force their victims into sex or labor for money. Monica Charleston was trafficked for years up and down the East Coast, starting when she was just 15 years old. A man promised her fame and safety. Instead, he forced her to have sex for money.
I thought he was my manager, but what he was really doing was taking me in front of other pimps to see how much I was worth.
The evil industry, according to the trafficking hotline, generates billions of dollars in profits by victimizing people in the United States and around the world.
They're evil, evil people, and they prey on the vulnerable. We have active cases here in Hampton Roads.
The latest data from the Polaris Project reveals there were 16,658 victims of trafficking identified in 2020 in the U.S. At least 10,836 were sold for sex, and at least 3,583 were sold for labor. So who was this happening to? An in-depth look at the data from 2020 reveals 67.8% of trafficking victims identify as female, 14.3% identify as male. According to the Federal Human Trafficking Report, 53% of victims in federal human trafficking prosecutions in 2020 were children. Program directors at Samaritan House, a locally based resource for trafficking survivors, they say it's happening to children here in Hampton Roads.
There are people middle school aged who have been sex trafficked and labor trafficked.
Yes.
In this area.
Our LGBT youth, our Black and brown youth, our children that are experiencing homelessness or have run away from home are incredibly vulnerable.
In fact, the Polaris Research Project shows 1 in 7 of the children reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children became victims of sex trafficking.
They run into potential gang recruitment, certainly violence, being the victims of violence, whether it's physical, sexual abuse, homelessness, protracted homelessness, recruitment into child sex trafficking.
Runaways or homeless youth are at the top of the list of people vulnerable to human trafficking. So are people with unstable housing, mental health concerns, substance abuse, and people who have recently migrated or relocated. That's what happened to this woman who was labor trafficked in North Carolina.
I was promised, this great life.
News 3 shared Alex Herring's story years ago. She moved to the U.S. from the UK and was duped by a trafficker who forced her to clean a home with hundreds of animals at a large farmhouse just outside of Charlotte.
And how can slavery still be happening?
Where is this modern-day slavery happening? Traffickers are forcing their victims to get money for sex and labor through escort services, pornography, illicit massages, bars and strip clubs, and domestic work. And how are these victims being recruited into this insidious industry? Traffickers used social media as a sinister means to recruit, especially their child victims. But the Polaris Project reports that in 2020, 31% of trafficking victims were recruited by a family member or caregiver, 27% by an intimate partner.
Oftentimes traffickers know who the survivor is. We're familiar with them, and they exploit our vulnerabilities.
That's what happened to Monica Charleston. It wasn't until her trafficker nearly ended her life that she was willing to risk it to get away.
I woke up in in the hospital after being found in the ditch. So that was it. And begging for my life.
She took her second chance and changed the course of her life, a fate so many victims are fighting for.
Samaritan House officials say Virginia recently ranked 15th in all the United States when it comes to human trafficking.
And Robin Gauthier, the executive director of Samaritan House, tells us the reasons that she believes that human trafficking has a hotbed here in Hampton Roads is all the military bases, as well as hotels and motels in major cities in our community.
She also believes access to local highways and waterways could also play a role. So we dug deeper to see how prevalent human trafficking is right here in Hampton Roads.
Predators will look for kids who are, who are willing to engage with them.
And sometimes the victims don't even know they're being trafficked.
When was the last time he sold you? And I just shook, I'll never forget it.
Investigative reporter Margaret Kavanaugh shows us what's being done to spot and stop human trafficking in our community by sharing the stories of those who are directly impacted and making a difference.
I didn't want to do it, so he would drug me and sell me to secure business relationships.
Forced to dance, do drugs, and beg others for money, Julia Hubbard says she was trafficked by an intimate partner for several years.
Nothing was private. Zero control over yourself, your surroundings, your who you interact with. It's degrading.
This survivor turned advocate says it wasn't until she called the human trafficking hotline to help another woman that she realized that she had been trafficked.
Did he take all of your money? Well, of course he did. When was the last time he sold you? And I just shook, I'll never forget it.
According to the latest numbers from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, Virginia ranks 22 for the highest number of calls. In 2020, they say there were almost 10,600 human trafficking cases reported across the country. Lisa Kersey is the executive director at Free Kind, a nonprofit that helps survivors.
It's hard to hear somebody's story because some of them started so young.
Experts say people may be vulnerable to trafficking if they have an unstable living situation, have previously experienced domestic violence or sexual abuse, have run away or been involved in the juvenile justice or child welfare system, or are addicted to drugs or alcohol.
It's not just people throwing kids in vans or women in vans. It is far more comprehensive and complex than that.
Many times a trafficker knows the victim, expressing a desire to help them.
But if a man comes into your world and he wants to take control of any part of your life, predators do that.
Predators looking to make a profit, and experts say it's different than other crimes.
If I sell you the guns, I got to go back and get more. If I sell drugs, I have to go back and get more. But if I sell a person, I can sell that same person over and over and over again.
To spot victims, her nonprofit goes into local jails.
It's where many of them realize by going through the class for the first time that they're victims. Most victims of trafficking wouldn't identify themselves that way.
If a victim's been arrested, they help them in court.
And we advocate for alternative sentencing to try to get them to healing and not just kind of cycling in and out of jail.
Her group also goes into 18 local schools.
At the middle school level, we really focus on self-confidence, healthy relationships, healthy boundaries, online safety.
The Virginia Beach Hotel Association is also doing training like teaching front desk employees, housekeeping and security guards how to spot warning signs.
Could be an older gentleman perhaps with two very young ladies. The ladies a lot of times don't speak. A lot of times they might look like they're under the influence of something.
Or he says if they pay with cash or want a room near an exit.
If you see someone kind of hanging outside of the room regularly and multiple people coming and going constantly, it's a sign to look for.
Experts say anyone can be trafficked, but they say people of color and members of the LGBTQ community are more likely to experience trafficking than other groups.
There is this giant misconception that all trafficking survivors are prostitutes and drug addicts, and it's just absolutely not true.
Now Hubbard is working to help others.
I still carry with me focused rage. I'm very, very proud of what I've done and what I'm trying to build and what I'm trying to create and the awareness that I'm trying to bring.
Bringing awareness to the problem while looking to spot it and working to end human trafficking. Margaret Kavanaugh, News 3.
Experts say to always keep your eyes peeled for situations that may seem suspicious. Now, according to the U.S. State Department, some red flags to identify a victim can be fearful or submissive behavior. It's how one Uber driver in Norfolk was able to save a woman that admitted she had been trafficked since she was 14 years old.
News 3 Investigates found documents that showed that an Uber driver called police when his young female passenger didn't know where she was going and said the situation seemed odd. Survivor-turned-advocate Olivia Raposa from Survivor Ventures, a local nonprofit, says she knows the horrors of being trafficked and praised the Uber driver who called authorities.
Just like that Uber driver, helped that girl get out of somewhere she couldn't get out of, you don't know what you could do for somebody.
If you think you have identified someone in a trafficking situation, alert law enforcement immediately at one of these numbers, 911 or 1-888-373-7888.
And it may not be what you first think of when it comes to human trafficking. You could be witnessing forced labor and not even know it. News 3 investigates human trafficking in all its forms. Next.
We are seeing so many children that are being lured online.
Then, how to talk to your kids and protect them from predators. The warning signs every parent should know.
And we're addressing solutions in our community. One local organization is helping human trafficking victims get back on their feet with the creation of a safe, secure, extended stay facility.
Plus, how survivors can recover from trauma so severe, experts say it can change their DNA, what the healing process looks like, and how we all can help.
And News 3 investigators share more about the cases happening right here in our own backyard. Next.
Worldwide, experts believe there are actually more instances of labor trafficking than sex trafficking happening. But there's a wider awareness about sex trafficking in the U.S. than there is about labor trafficking.
It's called modern-day slavery, and experts say it's happening in Hampton Roads.
Now, you may be witnessing forced labor and not even know it. Investigative reporter Margaret Cavanaugh is taking a closer look into this issue.
When you think of human trafficking, sex trafficking may come to mind, but there are other forms of this that may be right in front of you in restaurants, on farms, and construction sites.
But it's happening in so many places.
Forced labor happens when someone's compelled against their will to provide worker services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion.
The workers you see they're afraid to talk.
Like many others, Manuel Gago fled his home country of Venezuela 9 years ago to find a safer place to live.
It's sad, no? Because a lot of immigrants that came to this country came this American dream, and a lot of like me, we're escaping our nightmare in our country.
But he says for some, it's even worse when they get here. He works for the Legal Aid Justice Center, a group that provides legal services and help to low-income people. One of the places they go, the Eastern Shore. Many migrant workers, some could be isolated, being trafficked, and in need of help. He says poor living conditions, confiscation of passports and documentation, and little to no compensation are just a few problems seen across Virginia.
You can hear with all this promise when they hire you, amazing, and they never say you will be pay a lot of money. They say it will be a lot of work. So a lot of work means money, but when they can hear it's a lot of work and no money, and that's the problem.
Many believe that those involved in forced labor are here in the country illegally, but the National Institute of Justice found through a study that 71% are actually here on a working visa.
Do the stuff for the right thing. Get in line, do your paperwork. These people do that. And when they came, and the situation is worse. Because when they came, they take the passport, they take the visa, they say you need to pay me, I don't know, thousands of dollars so you can leave.
Experts say the top risk factors are recent migration or relocation, economic hardship, unstable housing, a criminal record, or a substance use concern. They say the people doing this own small and large companies.
Sometimes big employers say it's the contractor, it's not my fault, I try to collaborate, but they need to be more careful when they hire contractors to handle workers. No?
His group goes out to try to reach trafficked victims, working to get them help and make the public more aware that the food you eat, products and services you buy may come from someone being forced to work. Margaret Kavanaugh, News 3.
For victims coming from overseas, traffickers gain control by promising them a great life. Those promises are revealed to be empty ones, and they use the fear of deportation to control them. One woman knows this all too well because she lived it. Alex Herring is from the UK. She says she was forced to work for her trafficker, cleaning a home with hundreds of animals at a large farmhouse outside of Charlotte. She says once her tourist visa expired, she was stuck until one neighbor noticed signs of abuse and called social services.
That literally saved my life.
But Herring says there were other neighbors that didn't know what to do or didn't know what they were seeing.
The fact that somebody was uncomfortable, I don't think that's a good enough excuse to not try to do what you can to help somebody, because you could literally save someone's life.
Now you have the power to help save someone's life. It's not just about being reactive, but also proactive. Coming up, one tool to help the most vulnerable learn the warning signs of human trafficking. You may have seen the movie Taken. Well, human trafficking isn't always like it. Now, the film portrays what trafficking can look like, but the example of Liam Neeson on a crusade against a high-profile international sex trade operation is not the norm.
Now, remember, perpetrators and victims can appear to be everyday people, but according to researchers at Polaris, survivors have been trafficked by romantic partners, spouses, family, friends, people they trust.
Recent cases highlight the problem in our backyard. 42-year-old Thomas Hassel of Portsmouth is waiting to be sentenced after pleading guilty to trafficking a 17-year-old girl. That's according to federal court documents. An undercover sting went down at the Norfolk Marriott Waterside back in January of 2021. Records indicate Hassel posted naked pictures of the teen online, would set up dates with clients, and pay for hotel rooms while giving the girl drugs and taking at least 50% of the money. Prosecutors named almost 1,500 victims in federal human trafficking prosecutions in 2020. 53% were children and mostly girls.
Also in 2020, 89% of child victims in active sex trafficking cases were found to be between 14 and 17 years old. All commercial sex involving a minor is legally considered human trafficking.
And it's really important that as a community that we're looking for instances in which those vulnerabilities are being exploited and that we report them when we see them.
Protecting our youth by noticing the signs. That's exactly what one program aims to do. This year, the Hampton Roads Human Trafficking Task Force was one of 2 groups nationally chosen to participate in a federal initiative called Traffic Stop. The program focuses on educating high school kids about the dangers of human trafficking. In collaboration with Newport News Police and Newport News Public Schools, the action plan teaches identification and prevention curriculum, as well as training law enforcement to deliver the curriculum in schools. Traffic Stop also aims to promote online safety and build healthy relationships. But according to the Department of Homeland Security, it's important that education about human trafficking continues outside of the classroom too. That means having those talks at home.
So what can we do to protect our children? I spoke to one woman who created a tool to help educate parents and kids about one of the main ways traffickers target their victims.
There are so many Sierras out there. There are so many Sierras out there that have been found.
In the book Finding Sierra, a 12-year-old girl is missing. It's a fictional character that Derica Wilson, a former Virginia police officer and founder of the Black and Missing Foundation, says is based on real cases.
Why was it important to you to write this particular book right now?
It was very important to me, Jessica, because I wanted to meet kids where they are. We are seeing so many children that are being lured online.
According to the National Trafficking Hotline, More than 70% of trafficking victims were targeted via Facebook and Instagram in 2020. It's similar to Sierra Knight's story. A determined detective discovers Sierra met someone on a social media app, someone she trusted to pick her up from school one day before she vanished for weeks. The detective rallies her colleagues and local journalists to help bring Sierra home.
One person just can't do it alone. It takes all of us.
They soon find Sierra bruised and battered in a house where the person she met online was preparing to sell her into a sex trafficking ring.
So you're finding there are people middle school aged who have been sex trafficked and labor trafficked?
Yes.
LaShonda Carson is a social worker and program director at Samaritan House in Virginia Beach. It's a safe haven for domestic violence and human trafficking victims. She says there are children like Sierra here in Hampton Roads. Black and brown children, LGBT youth, and runaways, she says, are the most vulnerable to trafficking.
Why did they choose me? Or I must not be valuable for this to have happened, or for someone to not have cared, or for all of these other bystanders to not say something. And that's a deeply painful thing.
Carson says while social media is a big recruitment tool for traffickers, many victims are trafficked by friends or family members.
Oftentimes traffickers know who the survivor is. We're familiar with them, and they exploit our vulnerabilities.
Carson says protecting children can begin with a conversation about authority over their own bodies.
Asking permission for hugs and kisses versus forcing children to give hugs and kisses when somebody enters the room. Those are different ways that we can build those resiliency factors that could prevent trafficking.
And it is critical to keep a keen eye on who kids are talking to online so they don't get lured like Sierra.
This is not something that's happening abroad. This is happening every single day in your home.
While Wilson wrote a happy ending for Sierra, she knows reality can hold a much more sinister outcome.
And there are so many Sierras that we're still looking for.
Of the nearly 400 missing kids in Virginia, most are considered runaways. But the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children says just because a child chose to leave their home, it doesn't mean they aren't in danger. How their risks on the street ties directly into human trafficking. Next.
Then,
I'm still kicking, I'm still fighting, and she is a big reason of why.
Still ahead in our special report, an emotional reunion. We speak to a human trafficking survivor to find out how her story is having ripple effect on an entire community. Most missing kids are considered runaways. Now, while they chose to leave home, it doesn't make them any less vulnerable to predators trying to sell them for either sex or labor.
In fact, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children says it makes them a prime target. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's database reveals there are nearly 5,000 children reported missing in America right now. And 1 in 7 children reported missing became victims of sex trafficking, according to data from the Polaris Project.
91% of our cases are what we call endangered runaways.
Limi Kong-Sofer with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children says that's why reports of runaways should be taken seriously by law enforcement and the media.
They run into potential gang recruitment, certainly violence, being the victims of violence, whether it's physical, sexual abuse, homelessness, protracted homelessness, recruitment into child sex trafficking.
According to the Federal Human Trafficking Report, 53% of victims in federal human trafficking prosecutions in 2020 were children. 89% of child victims in active sex trafficking cases were between 14 and 17 years old. Runaways or homeless youth are at the top of the list of people vulnerable to human trafficking.
So we all know that runaways are not receiving the Amber Alert, and quite frankly, there's really no sense of urgency.
Derica Wilson is the co-founder of the Black and Missing Foundation. She says a lack of consistent urgency from law enforcement to find runaways leaves families to organize searches on their own.
They're having to create their own flyers because law enforcement is not creating them, and they're becoming even more vulnerable.
The longer kids are missing, the more likely traffickers will lure them in, selling them for sex or labor. If runaways are lucky enough to survive the streets and escape, trauma can trump the joy of returning home.
The person who goes missing is not the same person that returns home, because you don't know what they endured while they were out there.
The 2020 Federal Human Trafficking Report also reveals girls below the age of 18 are the most likely to be named as victims in human trafficking prosecutions, making up 56% of all victims. And for those girls, the top vulnerability was having run away from home.
Whatever you're running from, the street is not the answer. You know, we've seen the dangers of the street.
Runaways are being trafficked in our communities. One sting operation out of Hampton revealed a 14-year-old was being trafficked up and down the East Coast for sex. We spoke with Hampton police, talking about a case involving this man, Anthony Jermaine Foman. The self-proclaimed pimp recently pleaded guilty to sex trafficking of a minor and transportation of child pornography.
Our victim in the case was a 14-year-old runaway from Ohio.
Documents obtained by Newsry say it all started on December 15th, 2020. That's when officers say they found an ad for a woman and arranged to meet at a hotel on Mercury Boulevard for sex.
And when they got there, they found the girl, another woman, and Foman hiding behind the bathroom door. Through further investigation, officers found out Foman met the girl a month prior on social media. The documents go on to say Foman took the girl to 6 states up and down the East Coast: Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, South Carolina, and Florida, all to prostitute her.
Earlier this year, Hampton police got felony warrants for Foman's arrest on state charges. After Foman's arrest, authorities say child pornography involving the girl and himself were found on his phone. A Virginia Beach group is spearheading resources to help survivors transition from trafficking back to everyday life. I'm taking us inside Samaritan House.
Anything that you would think a victim of violence would need, we have here.
Robin Gauthier is the executive director of Samaritan House. For 40 years, the group based in Virginia Beach has been at the forefront of helping all kinds of survivors get back on their feet.
Anyone that wants to become self-sufficient, independent, in a life free of violence, they can do that here.
It all started in 1983 when a group of churches started helping the city of Virginia Beach with homeless shelters. Over time, they started specializing in helping survivors of violence and eventually human trafficking. What makes Samaritan House unique?
If they want to become independent and self-sufficient, we have a permanent housing program here. Sometimes our victims of trafficking could be here for 9 months or more, depending on how long it takes to prosecute the case.
Gauthier says human trafficking got on their radar in 2015 when Samaritan House was approached by Homeland Security investigations and eventually, with the help of Virginia's Attorney General's office, formed the Hampton Roads Human Trafficking Task Force. She tells us her group typically sees about 50 victims a year related to human trafficking. Gauthier says what makes Hampton Roads appealing to human traffickers are our hotels and motels, giving them a place to hide in plain sight.
Yeah, the way they maintain that anonymity is to move their victims. And so they often will move them from hotel to hotel, even within one region like Hampton Roads.
Along with case management, shelter, and support groups, Samaritan House also works with other groups to help survivors. One of those is Barb Ford, with the Untamed Spirit Therapeutic and Educational Program in Virginia Beach.
We're located on a 24-acre horse farm.
So once you start driving down the driveway, the cares just kind of start peeling off, and that's what we want. Just see the stress just melting away. You hear laughter and you get tears because people are just so overwhelmed with emotion.
Such an emotional moment.
Earlier this year, Samaritan House broke ground on The Hollow, a unique property in Virginia offering trafficking survivors under 18 years old a safe, secure, extended stay facility with education, vocation, and volunteer opportunities and mental health support.
There just is no other residential facility like that around here at all. Often if we find children, we have to move them several states away And it's so really difficult to find an appropriate, safe place for youth.
The Hollow is expected to be complete within the next 6 to 12 months. In the meantime, Samaritan House is committed to being a mainstay towards fighting trafficking in Hampton Roads.
Making sure that we can sustain our services for all the victims of trafficking that will be coming to us in the future.
4 years ago, we introduced you to Monica Charleston, who's brave enough to share her past with human trafficking.
And while her story was not easy to tell, the students at Smithfield High School helped amplify her voice. They drafted a bill to help protect human trafficking survivors.
News 3 anchor Aaron Miller shares with us where these students are today, if this bill became law in Virginia, and how Monica's truth has changed lives.
And there was a dark side of me, and there was still shame and guilt. I went through a huge healing process. It was hard, it was dark, but I got through it.
Leading our paths to cross again in Matt Ployd's government classroom at Smithfield High School.
4 years it's been, and we are here sitting in the same spot. How are you feeling today?
I feel stupendous. I feel happy. I'm very, very grateful.
You see, back in 2018, students drafted a human trafficking bill dubbed Monica's Law. The idea was to better advocate for human trafficking victims and survivors.
And I think about Monica often.
Macy Camper was one of the students involved. She says the project went far beyond the classroom.
You definitely take everything that you learn in Mr. Boyd's class with you throughout life. He's 15 pounds.
Now a mother herself, Camper says she parents with Monica in mind.
As a new mom, I'm definitely extremely careful, especially out in public. You take everything, what they say, to heart, and you just take it with you, and you adjust your life to it.
And now others across the state are adjusting their lives to it. The students shared their ideas with Delegate Emily Brewer, who was also working on human trafficking legislation. Her bill, HB 2234, was signed into law this year.
It's overwhelming, I think, to talk to people that have been impacted by legislation they've championed.
But Monica's courage to share her story stretches even farther than state law.
I haven't seen you in a while. I know.
We were there as Philip Taylor, another former student, saw Monica for the first time in years.
What does it mean for you to be here today?
Well, it means I'm alive. It means I've made it this far. I'm here. I'm still kicking. I'm still fighting. And she is a big reason of why.
The impact, I don't think, can be understated, and the ripples that she's created and these students have created, it's humbling.
One story of human trafficking changing the conversation in Smithfield, helping take Monica and others from a past filled with sorrow and trauma to a future of change and self-acceptance.
They knew me, and it's okay. And they allowed me time to heal and to grow. I'm worthy, of all these good things that I never thought that was for me. And peace is priceless.
So how else can policy be a part of the solution when it comes to human trafficking? Including people with real-world experience in the conversation is one way. How Virginia's commission is bringing survivors' voices to the table. Next. For years, a Hampton Roads human trafficking survivor has been using her experiences to raise awareness and help others who've been down a similar path.
That's right, and I'll show you how she's in a new position to help here in Hampton Roads and all across the Commonwealth.
I am a human trafficking survivor. This is a life, this is a culture, and all of us were trapped. Human trafficking is about coercion and manipulation. At the time, I didn't realize that I was a victim.
It's a path one Chesapeake woman, Tanya Gould, is all too familiar with. She was graduating from high school on a senior field trip when she recalls meeting one specific person.
My trafficker was someone who I fell in love with, and that was his way of bringing me into that life. And I thought that doing what he asked me to do was about us being together.
Gould says it turned into about 1.5 years of sex trafficking.
After the grooming period, after the honeymoon, when things seem really well and you feel like you're being protected and looked after, things become very dangerous. You realize it when your trafficker is asking you to bring in a certain amount of money. Or you realize that when the trafficker begins to control other parts of your life. He made me drop out of college. This was all about him and not about me.
She says with the help of a police officer, she eventually was able to get out. Today, she's paying it forward, helping other survivors, working with kids at CHKD, and on human trafficking policies at the state and federal level.
And I made that promise to myself that when I found a way out, I was going to, like Harriet Tubman, find a way to freedom for others.
This year, she was named Director of Anti-Human Trafficking under new Attorney General Jason Miyares' administration.
It says that our state leadership heard me. How do you empower people who've been bought and sold? How do you do that? Well, you do that by giving them leadership opportunities.
Since starting her new role, Gould says her focus has been partnering with groups in Hampton Roads and around Virginia, including Samaritan House, making sure they have the tools needed and are collaborating under one mission.
There are a lot of resources, but sometimes resources don't talk to each other because they're busy doing what they're doing.
One goal of hers in Hampton Roads is prioritizing a focus on minor sex trafficking.
What we've seen over the last couple of years is our kids who have come in and they're about 13 years old. COVID presented us this new wave of kids being trafficked at a younger age. This is urgent, and traffickers are always thinking ahead, and they're also meeting a demand. And so the demand are for younger kids. That's what it is. We need to be ahead of traffickers. We need to be ahead of the demand.
The first human trafficking task force for Hampton Roads was created in January 2017. To give you an idea of how big the problem of human trafficking is in Southeast Virginia, that task force initially anticipated that it would rescue and serve 10 to 12 victims of trafficking each year. But since then, Samaritan House reports they've provided support services and housing to 125 victims on a yearly basis. We continue shedding light on the horrors and reality of human trafficking, why experts are saying being trafficked can impact and change the human brain. Plus, the healing process for trauma victims and how we can all lend a helping hand in their road to recovery. We're highlighting how survivors heal and how we all can help them along the journey.
News 3 reporter Penny Commit has been digging into this issue, how trauma can change your DNA and what the road to recovery looks like.
If they didn't start to learn how to work with manipulation, they'd be dead.
Imagine spending every day in fear that it could be your last. Dee Dee Wallace with the Department of Homeland Security Investigations says that's the reality for victims of human trafficking.
You and I would never understand that the first person that tells you that I love you and I care about you is somebody that's also brutalizing you as they're doing it.
Some of my clients have had traumatic experiences 10, 20, 30 times a day.
Kelly Andrews is a Virginia Beach psychologist who also works with trafficking survivors. She says victims develop coping techniques to protect themselves, and that can have a permanent impact on the body.
Research shows that it can change your DNA.
But experts say the damage doesn't have to be permanent. The first step to recovery is admitting they're a victim.
When I talk to people and they're like, oh, they did all these dates, I'm like, oh, so they were raped. And they're like, why are you saying that? And I'm like, why are you saying it's a date?
People are really amazing at compartmentalizing and pushing things down.
The latest data from the Human Trafficking Hotline shows 31% of victims are recruited by a family member, 27% an intimate partner, people who are supposed to love and protect them, making their worst nightmares come true.
And the moms are told, unless you make a certain amount of money, you don't even know where your child is. So you're living in that chaos and in that emotional moment every single day, every single hour.
And living in constant chaos, research shows, has a significant impact on the human brain. Let's explain.
So your prefrontal cortex, when it's attached to your limbic system inside, and your brainstem, when they're all attached and they're working, that's a safe environment.
When experiencing trauma, your prefrontal cortex, which allows you to make rational decisions, opens. That disconnects it from your limbic system, which controls your emotions. When the two separate, people can become irrational.
So people quite literally flip their lid.
It's like taking a baseball cap off. You can't think straight. And you can't think straight because your prefrontal cortex is not working in conjunction with your limbic system.
And imagine that baseball cap being taken off several times a day, forcing you to constantly live in a state of fight or flight.
So if your brain is at this function where it's looking for danger at all times and it's more that high level, people aren't going to be able to concentrate in school. They're not going to be able to fulfill, a dream of going to college.
So can people ever fully heal from being trafficked?
Yes. I always tell clients if you couldn't recover, I wouldn't be in this business.
Reestablishing those connections in the brain can take weeks or even years.
It takes time, but it definitely happens. Therapy is going to help a person understand that they can connect with people and they can live a healthy, happy life.
Andrew says victims must learn to reprocess memories, and they can do that through therapy.
Trauma creates the need for protection, not connection, and instead therapy is going to help a person understand that they can connect with people and they can live a healthy, happy life.
Andrews and Wallace agree, no matter the trauma, there is light at the end of the tunnel.
I can't imagine being raped. I can't imagine being sexually assaulted or physically abused to the degree that they are, but they still get up every single day. They still try to find joy. So it's like an incredible gift that I feel like I get to meet people like this because it just shows me the strength and character that a survivor has.
Human trafficking is a crisis worldwide, across our country, and here at home in Hampton Roads.
If someone is forcing you to do something you are uncomfortable with, whether it is sex, whether it is working, no matter what it is, please reach out for help.
Nothing was private, zero control over yourself, your surroundings, your who you interact with. It's degrading.
A lot of the clients I work with blame themselves. I should have, I could have, I should have escaped.
Every single day, there are 500,000 predators that are active online.
It's hard to trust. It's hard to look out of your situation and say, after this situation is over, my life is going to be grand.
Most victims of trafficking wouldn't identify themselves that way. So much of the trafficking happens in intimate partner relationships and in families, so there's a complex relationship and bond there.
Oftentimes they are bribing you, oftentimes they are providing you housing, they're providing you things that you really need, some basic needs, but there are programs out there that can provide those same things for you.
What helped me during my healing process was just people being kind. We're looking for those moments and those glimpses of goodness and kindness, and so that's really important. That's really what helps build trust in order to just kind of continue on your healing journey.
Thank you for joining us for this News 3 special report. I'm Jessica Larche.
And I'm Zach Dahlheimer. Hopefully this knowledge gives you the courage to help yourself and help others.
And remember, you are never alone.